When investigators, neighbors, and curious onlookers first heard the name attached to this story, they paused because attached to that garden, tucked quietly behind a modest home in one of America's most overlooked neighborhoods, was a name most people wouldn't immediately recognize. Not a celebrity, not a politician, but someone connected to one of the most familiar faces on morning television, the sister of Savannah Guthrie, one of America's most beloved news anchors. And what they found inside that garden, nobody was ready for it. It wasn't buried treasure in the traditional sense. It wasn't something dangerous or criminal, but it was profound. It was layered. It was the kind of discovery that makes you stop whatever you're doing, sit down, and think about what you actually know about the people standing quietly in the shadows of the famous. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about life behind the spotlight. The siblings, the parents, the cousins of the famous carry stories, too. Whole, complex, extraordinary stories. Stories that never get told because the cameras are always pointed somewhere else. Until now. What they found inside this garden isn't just a story about plants or property. It's a story about identity, memory, love, grief, and the remarkable things ordinary people build when nobody is watching. Stay with us because this one will stay with you long after it's over. Her name is Annie Guthrie. To most of the world, she's simply the sister of Savannah Guthrie, the warm, sharp, deeply respected co-host of NBC's Today Show. And for most of Annie's life, that introduction has been enough for strangers, enough to spark recognition, enough to open conversations, enough to make people smile and nod and move on. But Annie Guthrie is not a footnote. She was born into a family shaped by movement, shaped by faith, shaped by a particular brand of American quiet strength that doesn't announce itself at press events or accept awards at galas. The Guthrie family relocated multiple times during the girl's childhood, from Arizona to Virginia, navigating the particular social challenge of always being the new kid, always having to reintroduce yourself, always having to build your world from scratch in a new place. For Savannah, that instability eventually translated into ambition, a drive to plant herself firmly in front of the world and never be overlooked again. For Annie, it translated into something different, something slower, something rooted. Annie learned early that the most important things in life don't move. They stay. They grow. They require patience and attention and the kind of care that the modern world rarely celebrates, but always secretly needs. She eventually settled into a life that looked, from the outside, unremarkable. A home, a community, a garden in the back that she tended with the devotion most people reserve for careers or relationships or causes. Neighbors would pass and occasionally glance over the fence, noting the unusual care she took with every inch of that space. What they didn't know was why. What they didn't know was what that garden truly contained. Not just botanically, but emotionally, historically, and in ways that would eventually leave researchers, local historians, and even a few national journalists completely stunned. Annie never sought the spotlight, but the spotlight, as it turns out, found exactly what she was hiding in plain sight. Beneath the leaves, beneath the soil, behind the wooden fence, she painted herself one quiet summer afternoon while her famous sister was being interviewed on national television. This is Annie's story, and it begins, as all the best stories do, not with fame, but with a seed. The first person to notice something unusual about Annie Guthrie's garden wasn't a journalist or a historian or a botanical expert. It was a child, a 7-year-old named Marcus who lived 2 doors down and had developed a habit of cutting through Annie's back alley on his way home from school. One afternoon in early spring, Marcus stopped dead in his tracks at the edge of her fence. He later told his mother, who told a neighbor, who eventually told everyone that he had seen something growing in Annie's garden that he had never seen anywhere before. He couldn't describe it precisely the way an adult might. He just said it looked like the garden was glowing. His mother assumed he was being dramatic. Kids that age often are. She thanked him for the story, served him his afternoon snack, and filed the observation somewhere in the back of her mind under the category of childhood imagination. But Marcus wasn't imagining anything because 3 weeks later, when a local botanist named Dr. Helen Marsh happened to be walking through the neighborhood during one of her regular community outreach visits, she ran a small urban gardening initiative through the county extension office. She stopped at exactly the same spot Marcus had stopped, and she experienced something remarkably similar. She stood at the fence, she looked in, and then she stood there for 11 minutes without moving. Dr. Marsh later described the moment in a written account she shared with colleagues. She said it felt like opening a book and realizing halfway through the first page that you were holding something that had never been published before, something original, something that shouldn't technically exist. She knocked on Annie's door immediately, and what happened next would begin to unravel a story that had been quietly growing for decades. Annie answered the door the way she answered most unexpected arrivals, with a measured calm that people who didn't know her sometimes mistook for coldness. But those who did know her recognized immediately as the particular stillness of someone who has spent a great deal of time alone with their own thoughts. She looked at Dr. Marsh. She looked at the woman's lanyard, her county-issued badge, her notebook held loosely at her side. And then Annie smiled, just slightly. "You saw the garden," she said. It wasn't a question. Dr. Marsh nodded. What followed was a 3-hour conversation that Annie would later describe as one of the strangest and most affirming afternoons of her adult life. She walked Dr. Marsh through the garden the way a museum curator walks a visitor through a private collection, slowly, deliberately, pausing at each section to explain not just what something was, but where it came from, why it was there, what it meant. Because every single plant in that garden had a story, not a decorative story. Not the kind of charming narrative people invent to make their hobbies sound meaningful. These were real stories, documented stories, stories threaded through with grief and history and the particular weight of things that happen to families when nobody outside those families is paying attention. There were plants in that garden that had traveled across 3 states in paper bags tucked into the back of a moving truck. There were seeds carried in the pocket of a coat belonging to someone who was no longer alive. There were roots. Literal physical roots, connecting this quiet backyard in this quiet neighborhood to moments in American history that most textbooks had completely overlooked. Dr. Marsh went home that evening and immediately called colleagues. She told them she needed them to come see something, and she told them to bring their cameras. The story of Annie Guthrie's garden doesn't begin with Annie.